The stale air in my workshop always smelled of bone, dust, and something faintly chemical, a scent I'd grown accustomed to, almost fond of. It was the perfume of my exile, the quiet hum of my self-imposed penance. For 3 years, my world had shrunk to the size of this cluttered space, tucked away in the forgotten corner of an industrial park. No university halls, no eager students, just the silent company of skeletal fragments and the gnawing echo of my own failures. Then the phone rang. It was a jarring interruption, a shard of the outside world piercing the careful insulation I'd built. I stared at the caller ID, my stomach tightening. The university, my alma mater, the place I'd sworn I'd never set foot in again. Hesitation warred with a flicker of something I hadn't felt in a long time, curiosity. I let it ring, the insistent chirping grating on my nerves. Finally, I snatched it up. UserZU, I answered, my voice rough from disuse, a clipped professional tone on the other end. Dr. UserZU, this is Detective Davies. I understand I am no longer affiliated with the university. That's correct, I said, my gaze drifting to a half-finished reconstruction on my workbench, a mosaic of ancient ceramic shards. I'm retired. We've had a situation, Davies continued, his voice devoid of warmth. A series of unfortunate incidents. They're calling them ritualistic. The victims are students. We're at a loss. Someone suggested I might be able to help. Ritualistic. The word hung in the air, heavy and ominous. My mind, despite its deliberate dormancy, began to stir. It was a reflex, an old habit I tried to bury. What kind of incidents? I asked, my fingers already tracing invisible patterns on the cool surface of my workbench. Graphic, Davies said, and I heard a subtle shift in his tone, a hint of unease. And specific. The killer is leaving things, symbols, arrangements, things that don't make immediate sense to us. I closed my eyes, picturing the sterile, echoing corridors of the university's forensic department, the place where I'd once been a rising star before the incident, before the whispers, the accusations, the shame that had driven me into this self-imposed wilderness. The shame that still pricked at me in the quiet hours, a phantom limb of regret. I'm not officially involved anymore, I said, the words tasting like ash. We understand that, Dr. UserZU, but this is beyond our expertise. The preliminary findings, they're strange, disturbingly so. We need someone with my unique perspective. Unique perspective. It was a euphemism, I knew. They meant the disgraced anthropologist who had once delved too deep into the darker corners of human history, who had let her fascination with the macabre overshadow her judgment. The one who had blurred the lines between academic curiosity and something else. Where are I asked, the words escaping before I could stop them. Davies rattled off an address. The county medical examiner's office, a place I knew well, though not in its current state. We're experiencing a city-wide power outage, Davies added, as if sensing my reluctance. It's making things difficult. We're operating on backup generators, but it's less than ideal. The scene is unsettling, even by our standards. We need here, now. A power outage. The medical examiner's office during a power outage. It was a place I'd once thrived, dissecting the stories etched into bone, piecing together lives from scattered fragments. I looked around my workshop, at the silent testament to my retreat. The decision felt like stepping off a cliff, but the pull of the unknown, the morbid allure of the puzzle, was too strong. I'll be there, I said, and even to my own ears my voice sounded different, sharper, more alive. My exile was about to be interrupted. The air in the medical examiner's office during a power outage tasted like stale coffee and ozone. My flashlight beam, a shaky white finger, cut through the gloom, illuminating dust motes dancing in the narrow cone of light. The emergency generator, a wheezing beast in the corner, sputtered a weak, inconsistent hum, doing little to chase away the oppressive silence. I've been here countless times before, usually under the sterile glow of fluorescent tubes, but this was different. The darkness clung to everything, amplifying the whispers of the building, the creaks of settling foundations, and the nervous flutter in my own chest. A gruff cough broke the spell. UserZU. I swiveled my light. A tall, stern-faced woman stood silhouetted against the faint glow of a distant exit sign. Her lab coat was pristine, a stark contrast to the general disarray of the room. This had to be the chief medical examiner. "That's me," I replied, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet. I kept my flashlight beam trained on her face. He had sharp, assessing eyes. "Dean sent me a memo, said you were available." The way she said available dripped with a skepticism that was almost palpable. She didn't seem pleased to see me. "I am," I said, stepping forward, my boots crunching on something I didn't want to identify. "And I understand there's been a situation." She gestured with a gloved hand, a sweep of her arm encompassing the room. "Situation is putting it mildly. 3 students, all gone, and the way they were found." She trailed off, her gaze flicking to a covered form on one of the stainless steel tables. "You'll see." Her dismissiveness pricked at me. I'd been away from academia, away from the university for a long time. My reputation, or what was left of it, preceded me. But I'd earned my stripes here, deciphered more secrets from Bone than anyone else in this department. The other 2 are here. She indicated the covered form. "But the precinct wants this one processed immediately," said it's the primary scene. Primary scene. The words felt heavy. I walked towards the table, my flashlight beam steady now. The chief medical examiner followed, her movements economical, her expression unreadable. As I approached, I could see the outline of a human body beneath the sheet. It was unnervingly still. "What happened?" I asked, my voice low. "Found him in his dorm room, not exactly a natural death." She paused. "Ritualistic. Some of the uniforms are calling it. Personally, I call it messy." I reached the table, my breath catching. Ritualistic. I reached for the corner of the sheet, my fingers brushing against the cool, taut fabric. "May I?" I asked, looking at the chief. She gave a curt nod. "Be my guest, just try not to make a bigger mess than he already did." With a deep breath, I pulled back the sheet. The sight that greeted me made my stomach clench. His skin was unnaturally pale, almost translucent. But it was the arrangement of his limbs, the stark, deliberate positioning that drew my attention. His arms were splayed, palms upward as if in supplication. His legs were crossed at the ankles, and then I saw it. Etched onto his chest, a deep, intricate symbol. It wasn't just a scratch, it was carved with precision, a deliberate act. The symbol itself was unfamiliar, a series of interlocking geometric shapes that seemed to writhe in the flickering emergency light. It looked ancient, tribal, something from a forgotten corner of history. "What is that?" the chief medical examiner asked, her voice losing some of its edge, replaced by a flicker of professional curiosity. I leaned closer, my flashlight beam tracing the lines of the carving. My mind raced, sifting through years of accumulated knowledge, obscure texts, forgotten cultures. This wasn't random. This was a message. But what was it saying? "I don't know," I admitted, the words feeling like a betrayal of my own expertise. But it was the truth. This symbol. It was unlike anything I'd encountered in my previous work. "But it's not random. This was done with purpose." I moved my light to his hands. His fingernails were clean, no defensive wounds. His wrists bore faint marks, as if from restraints, but they were too delicate to be conclusive. Then my beam settled on his left palm. There, pressed into the skin as if branded, was another symbol, smaller, simpler, but undeniably linked to the one on his chest. It was a single, stylized eye. "An eye," I murmured, "and a more complex design." I looked back at the chief. "Did the other victims have anything like this?" "We haven't examined them thoroughly yet," she said, her voice tight. "The precinct was too eager to get this one out." She gestured vaguely towards the door. "They answered the other scenes were similar, messy, but they didn't mention carvings, messy, and now this symbol. The pieces were starting to form a picture, a disturbing one. The university, my alma mater, the place I'd once called home, was now a hunting ground. And I, UserZU, the disgraced anthropologist, was its reluctant hunter. This was just the beginning. I could feel it. The air in the medical examiner's office during a power outage was thick with the coppery tang of death, now mixed with a new, acrid scent, the ozone crackle of a failing generator. My flashlight beam, A shaky white finger danced across the stark linoleum floor, illuminating dust motes swirling like tiny ghosts. The usual hum of refrigeration units was replaced by an unnerving silence, broken only by the distant groan of emergency lights struggling to hold their ground. Anything, UserZU. The detective's voice, usually a gravelly rumble, sounded strained. He stood by the stainless steel examination table, a hulking shadow against the dim emergency lighting. I ran a gloved finger over the intricate symbol etched into the victim's clavicle. It wasn't a wound, not in the traditional sense. More like a brand. This was the same symbol I'd found scrawled on a crumpled piece of parchment tucked beneath the student's outstretched hand. "It's not random," I murmured, my voice raspy. I leaned closer, the beam of my flashlight catching the subtle nuances of the carving. The lines were precise, almost surgical, yet possessed a deliberate roughness as if carved with a primitive tool. "This isn't just some graffiti, it's archaic." The detective grunted, a sound of impatience. "Archaic how? Like old graffiti." "Older," I corrected, my gaze sweeping over the victim's exposed rib cage. "The structure, the symmetry. It reminds me of certain sigils from pre-classical civilizations, but this is definitely more recent. The tool marks are too clean for centuries of weathering." I traced the outer curve of the symbol. "See this slight curvature here, and the way the central motif is recessed. It's a variation, a deliberate alteration." My mind was already racing, sifting through years of dusty texts and forgotten lore. My disgraced career had, ironically, forced me to dive deeper into the obscure corners of anthropological history, the kind of esoteric knowledge that made most academics scoff. A signature, and I think it points to something specific within the university. I stood up, the movement feeling too loud in the sudden quiet. I needed to get back to my temporary office, the cramped, windowless room in the archaeology department basement. I had my research materials there, the ones I'd smuggled in, the ones that felt like my last lifeline. "Can you get this body to my lab?" I inquired, my voice firm. "I need to do a more thorough analysis, and I want access to the university's historical archives, all of them." The beam of my flashlight, now held steady, illuminated the grim set of his jaw. "Because right now, this killer is leaving us a trail. And this symbol is the first breadcrumb. If we don't follow it, if we don't understand what it means, he'll just keep leaving more and more bodies." He sighed, a long, weary exhalation that seemed to carry the weight of the entire situation. "Fine, but I'm going to have to explain this archaic symbol to me and to my superiors in plain English. No academic jargon." "Deal," I responded, a sliver of grim satisfaction coiling in my gut. Back in the basement, the air was stale and smelled faintly of mildew and old paper. I searched for university crests, for forgotten fraternities, for any mention of esoteric societies. My fingers flew across the keyboard, cross-referencing symbols, historical timelines, and university founding documents. The symbol wasn't a direct match for anything I'd found so far, but the stylistic elements. They were there, lurking in the periphery of my searches. Then I found it. A faded, digitized photograph from a 1920s university yearbook. Tucked away in a section detailing student clubs was a picture of a group of young men and women, their faces earnest and serious. And emblazoned on a banner held aloft by two of them was a symbol. It was similar, strikingly so. The same central motif, the same angularity, but the variation I'd noted was absent. This was the precursor, of course. My research led me down a rabbit hole of hushed rumors and veiled references. The Obsidian Quill was an invitation-only group, whispered to have been founded by a group of particularly intellectual students and a few eccentric faculty members. They were known for their intense intellectual debates, their fascination with ancient texts, and their sometimes morbid curiosities. The university had officially disbanded them decades ago, citing concerns over their increasingly unorthodox activities. Unorthodox. That was a polite word for it. The more I dug, the more I found hints of rituals, of ceremonies performed in secret, of a deep-seated belief in the power of the physical form. This was more than just a symbol, it was a declaration, a warning. The killer wasn't just targeting students, they were targeting a specific kind of student, or perhaps they were trying to recreate something, to revive something. I pulled up the victim's profile again. The student, a bright young woman in the classics department, had been a known enthusiast of obscure historical texts. She'd even written a paper on ancient burial rites. The other victim, a history major, had been researching forgotten university traditions. They weren't random, they were chosen. My flashlight beam flickered, threatening to die. This wasn't just about solving a murder. And the obsidian quill, or whatever its modern iteration was, felt like the key. The killer was operating on a level I understood, a level that spoke of history, of ritual, of a profound and terrifying obsession with the human form. I just had to figure out who was speaking that language now. The silence in the medical examiner's office during a power outage was a heavy, suffocating blanket. Not the usual quiet hum of refrigerators and ventilation, but a dead, absolute stillness that pressed in on my eardrums. The backup generator had sputtered to life, casting a sickly yellow glow from emergency lights, but it did little to dispel the growing unease that had settled over me since the first body. My colleague, the grim-faced medical examiner, fumbled with a flashlight, its beam bouncing erratically across the sterile surfaces. "This is inconvenient," he muttered, his voice rough. "Understatement," I replied, my own flashlight beam cutting a steady path. The air still held the faint, metallic tang of disinfectant, but beneath it something else was beginning to assert itself, a cloying sweetness like overripe fruit left too long in the sun. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but my senses, honed by years of working with the departed, picked it up. We were here for the preliminary examination of the second victim. The call had come in an hour ago, a frantic whisper from a security guard who discovered the body in an unused storage room in the university's oldest library wing. Another student. Another ritualistic display. The room itself was cramped, filled with dusty boxes of forgotten archives and the skeletal remains of defunct lab equipment. The body lay on a makeshift examination table, a large, industrial metal cart draped with a stained canvas sheet. The yellow emergency light glinted off the pale skin. As the medical examiner began his work, I circled the scene, my flashlight beam sweeping over the details. The pose was deliberate, unsettlingly familiar. The same unnatural stillness, the same vacant stare directed at the ceiling, as if the student had been caught mid-thought, mid-breath. But this time there was more. It wasn't just decorative. Small, intricately carved bone fragments were embedded within it, each one depicting a tiny, almost microscopic symbol. My breath hitched. These weren't the simple geometric shapes from the first incident. These were finer, more complex. Runes, perhaps, or something older, something I'd only seen in faded texts. Anything. The medical examiner asked, his voice strained. I knelt, bringing my flashlight closer to the collar. The bone fragments were cool to the touch, even through my gloves. I traced one of the symbols with the tip of my gloved finger. It was a spiral, but not a perfect one. It twisted inward, then outward again, a dizzying, almost hypnotic design. It's more intricate. The symbols are more defined. And the material, it's not just twine. There's a ritualistic element to this, much stronger than before. I looked at the student's hands. They were splayed, palms up, and nestled within each palm was a small, smooth stone. Not just any stones, I realized with a jolt. River stones. Perfectly rounded, worn smooth by countless years of water. And on each stone, etched with an impossibly fine tool, was a single, stylized eye. My mind raced, trying to connect the dots. The first victim, the symbol. The second victim, the collar, the stones, the eyes. It felt like a language, a story being told through the dead. But what was the narrative? What was the killer trying to communicate? The first one was a message, I murmured, more to myself than to the medical examiner. This is a chapter, or perhaps a passage. The medical examiner grunted, his attention focused on the body. The cause of death appears to be the same. No obvious trauma beyond what's necessary for the presentation, but the toxicology screens will be crucial. I stood up, pacing the small space. The sweet, cloying scent seemed to intensify, making my stomach churn. It wasn't just decay, it was something added, something deliberate. "Did I notice the smell?" I asked, turning to him. He paused, then sniffed the air, faintly, like incense or something floral gone bad. "It's overpowering near the body," I said, my gaze fixed on the student's face. I thought back to the symbols on the collar. I'd seen something similar once in a dusty archive at the university's special collections. The spiral, the eye. They were meant to ward off or attract something or someone. This was escalating. The killer was growing bolder, more elaborate. They weren't just leaving a mark, they were constructing a tableau. The university, with its long history and hidden secrets, was proving to be fertile ground for whatever twisted obsession was driving this killer. And I, UserZU, was somehow at the center of it all, a reluctant interpreter of death. The air in the medical examiner's office during a power outage hung thick and still, a cloying mixture of formaldehyde and something else. Something metallic and coppery that always made my stomach clench. The emergency lights cast long, dancing shadows, turning the familiar space into a disorienting maze. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, illuminating the pale, still face of the latest victim. He looked so young, so utterly lost. I traced the symbols etched onto the frayed collar of his shirt with a gloved finger, not carved, not drawn, but somehow burned in. "Anything, UserZU?" The medical examiner's assistant's voice was a low murmur, amplified by the oppressive silence. He was fumbling with a portable generator, its sputtering cough a jarring intrusion. "The inscription," I said, my voice tight. "It's a specific script, not Latin, not Greek, something older." I'd felt it the moment I saw it, a ghost of recognition that had nagged at me all night. An archive, a dusty, forgotten corner of the university library. The generator finally roared to life, bathing the room in a harsh, flickering fluorescent glow. I couldn't wait. My mind was already racing, piecing together fragments of memory. Back on campus, the familiar Gothic architecture felt different now, imbued with a sinister undertone. The university's library, usually a sanctuary of hushed contemplation, felt like a labyrinth holding its breath. I headed straight for the special collections, a place I hadn't set foot in since my own disgrace. The air inside was cooler, carrying the faint scent of aging paper and leather. A stern-faced librarian, her hair pulled back in a severe bun, eyed me with thinly veiled suspicion. "May I help?" Her tone was polite, but her eyes were sharp, assessing. She recognized me, I could tell, the disgraced anthropologist. "I'm looking for records pertaining to the university's early history," I said, keeping my voice even. "Specifically, any mention of student societies or clandestine groups from the late 19th and early 20th centuries." She tapped a long fingernail on her desk. "That's a rather broad request, wouldn't I say?" "I understand," I conceded, forcing a small smile. "But I'm hoping to find information about a group that might have been unofficial, perhaps with a focus on historical research or even obscure folklore." I chose my words carefully, trying to sound like an earnest researcher, not a woman chasing ghosts. Her expression remained impassive. "Our digital catalog is quite comprehensive. If I have specific keywords, I'm afraid it's more of a feeling," I admitted, feeling a prickle of frustration. "A hunch. I'm interested in their traditions, their practices, any artifacts they might have collected." She sighed, a subtle puff of air that spoke volumes. "This requires a personal consultation with the head archivist, Professor Albright." She didn't sound enthusiastic. Professor Albright's office was a monument to academia, overflowing with books and ancient-looking maps. He was a man whose tweed jacket seemed as much a part of him as his skin. He regarded me with a mild curiosity, his brow furrowed. "UserZU," he said, the name rolling off his tongue with a hint of surprise and perhaps a touch of pity. "It's been a while. I heard about my situation." I nodded, my jaw tight. "I'm here about a research project, Professor." He steepled his fingers. The librarian mentioned my unusual query. Student societies, I say. We have a rather extensive collection on official fraternities and sororities, but clandestine and obscure folklore. That's a bit more nebulous. I pulled out a small notebook, flipping to a page where I'd sketched the symbols from the victim's collar. I'm looking for anything that might resemble this, or any historical society that might have used similar iconography. It's connected to some very old university traditions. Albright leaned closer, his eyes narrowing as he studied the sketch. He ran a hand over his chin. This is intriguing. It has a certain archaic resonance. He stood and walked over to a towering bookshelf, his fingers trailing along the spines of ancient volumes. We do have some private papers, journals, correspondence, collections that were donated without much formal cataloging. Often these are the most revealing. He pulled down a thick, leather-bound tome, its cover worn smooth with age. This belonged to a Professor Silas Croft. He was on faculty in the late 1800s, known for his rather eccentric interests. He was a bit of a collector of curiosities. My heart gave a little lurch. Silas Croft. Albright carefully opened the journal. The pages were brittle, the ink faded. He turned them slowly, his breath catching occasionally. Here, look at this. He pointed to a passage, the script dense and looping. They met in secret, practice certain. Rites, he called them. And they were obsessed with ancient symbols and forgotten languages. My eyes scanned the text, my pulse quickening. Croft's descriptions were vague, filled with academic jargon, but the underlying sentiment was clear. This wasn't just an academic club. There was a fervor to his writing, a hint of something dangerous. He mentions a specific symbol. Albright continued, his finger tracing a rough drawing in the margin. They believed it was a key to unlocking something. He doesn't specify what. The drawing was rough but unmistakable. It was a stylized version of the symbol I'd seen. The same motif, albeit less refined. It was a dead end, and yet it was the first real lead I'd had. "This is fascinating, Professor," I said, my voice a little too eager. "Do I have any other materials from Croft?" Unfortunately, UserZU Silas Croft's collection was disorganized. Much of it was lost or deemed irrelevant over the years. The university prefers to focus on its more reputable history. These old eccentricities are often swept under the rug. He looked at me directly then, his gaze steady. The university had a secret, and they were determined to keep it that way. This was more than just a historical footnote, and I was determined to follow it, no matter who tried to stop me. The air in the medical examiner's office during a power outage was thick, not just with the usual formaldehyde scent, but with an unnerving stillness. Emergency lights flickered on, casting long, dancing shadows that made the neatly arranged tools on the stainless steel tables seem like instruments of a different, more ancient craft. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, landing on the latest victim laid out on the cold slab. Another student, this one a young woman, her features serene in death, almost peaceful. It was the unsettling calm that always got me, the stark contrast to the violence that had clearly preceded it. I leaned closer, my gloved fingers tracing the faint markings etched onto her clavicle. The same intricate, almost calligraphic symbols I'd seen on the others. The university's history department had been surprisingly tight-lipped, stonewalling me at every turn, but my persistence and the sheer brutality of these murders had finally forced their hand. Well, that part was still hazy, obsessed with something that involved sacrifice and perhaps immortality. The attending technician, a burly man with weary eyes, coughed softly from the doorway. "Anything, Professor?" I didn't look up. "The same. The markings are identical, clean, precise, almost reverent." I paused, my mind replaying the symbols, trying to find a pattern, a key that would unlock their meaning. There was a deliberate artistry to them, a language I felt I should understand but couldn't quite grasp. It was like looking at a familiar face in a dream, the features just out of reach of recognition. "Reverent," the technician repeated, his voice laced with skepticism. "Looks like some kind of occult nonsense to me." "Occult is just a label for what we don't understand yet," I murmured, my focus entirely on the task at hand. My flashlight beam moved to her hands, clean, no defensive wounds. She'd known her killer, or at least she hadn't fought. That was another disturbing consistency. I moved to the next examination table, where the previous victim, a young man, lay waiting for me. His case had been the one that had truly unsettled me. The way his skull had been meticulously cleaned, his bones polished to a near gleam, and the symbols carved with such delicate precision into the inner surface of his sternum, a place almost impossible to reach without dismemberment. It was a perverse act of intimacy, a gruesome dedication. As I examined the young man's remains, my fingers brushed against a small, tarnished silver pendant tucked beneath his collar. It was shaped like a quill, elegantly curved. My breath hitched. I'd seen this before. I knew I had. This was personal. My mind flashed back, a jolt of unwelcome memory. My undergraduate days. Professor Thorne, my mentor, a man whose passion for ancient rites had bordered on obsession. He'd worn a similar pendant. I remembered a research project, a deep dive into obscure medieval texts, a project I'd abandoned in my final year, unable to reconcile the academic pursuit with the unsettling implications. Thorne had been disappointed. He'd called it a lack of dedication, a failure of scholarly nerve. "Professor," the technician's voice cut through my reverie. "Are I all right? I've gone pale." I forced a smile, a tight, brittle thing. It was heavier than it looked, cool against my skin even through the latex glove. Etched onto its surface, almost too small to see, was a single tiny symbol, a stylized owl, the same owl that had adorned Professor Thorne's office door. My heart began to thud, a dull, insistent rhythm against my ribs. This wasn't just about a historical society anymore. This was about my past, about Thorne. And if he was involved, then these murders, they were not random acts of violence. They were a continuation, a ritual. I looked back at the young woman on the other table, then at the young man. Students. They were all students, and the university, my alma mater, was hiding something. Something that had festered for decades and was now, it seemed, claiming lives. The symbols, the pendant, Thorne. It was all coalescing into a terrifying picture. And I was somehow, inexplicably, at its center. My own buried past, unearthed by a killer's hand. The weight of it pressed down on me, heavy and suffocating. The air in the medical examiner's office during a power outage was thick, cloying, not just from the usual odors, but from the sheer, oppressive stillness. The emergency lights cast long, wavering shadows that danced like specters on the tiled walls. The owl pendant, still clutched in my palm, felt like a tiny, silent accusation. He stood by the doorway, a silhouette against the faint glow from the hallway. I shook my head, the movement stiff. Just more questions. I looked down at the body on the table. Another student. This one was different, though. The usual meticulous arrangement of the remains was there, but something was off, a missing piece. Off how? The detective pressed, stepping closer, his breath misted in the cool air. The bone structure around the clavicle, it's been altered, not broken, but reshaped, deliberately. I pointed with my gloved finger, careful not to touch anything, like they were trying to mimic something. The detective grunted, peering closer. Mimic what? I don't know yet. The owl symbol, the stylized owl, it had to mean something. I'd spent the last 24 hours poring over every text I could get my hands on, cross-referencing historical burial rites, obscure cult symbols, anything that might connect the dots. My own office, a stark reminder of my fall from grace, offered little comfort. "This is the third one, UserZU," the detective said, his voice devoid of emotion, yet I heard the weight of it. "Third student, same signature. These are signals. The killer wants us to see them, wants me to see them." I held up the pendant. This owl, it's not just a random trinket, it's a marker. A flicker of something, skepticism, weariness, crossed his face. A marker for what? Another dead end. I ignored him, my gaze drifting to the array of tools laid out on a nearby tray. Scalpels, forceps, brushes. The tools of my old trade, now wielded by others. It was a bitter pill. The clavicle, the reshaped bone. It wasn't just about mimicking something, it was about representing something. The clavicle, I murmured, more to myself than to the detective. It's the collarbone, the wishbone. What if the killer isn't just mutilating them? What if they believe they're collecting something? The detective was silent, his eyes fixed on me. He'd seen me at my worst, seen the disgrace that had landed me here, away from the lecture halls and the respect I'd once commanded. He was waiting for me to unravel for the obsession that had cost me everything to finally consume me. But this was different. This wasn't just about proving myself. I returned to the victim's remains, my focus sharpening. The reshaped clavicle, the owl pendant. I closed my eyes, picturing the initial reports, the crime scene photos that had been burned into my memory. The first victim, the placement of the hands. The second, the specific way the hair had been arranged. Small details that had seemed insignificant then, but now. The owl, I breathed, opening my eyes. It's not just a symbol of wisdom or of the night, it's a predator. It watches, it waits, and it strikes. I looked at the detective, my voice gaining a new urgency. What if the killer believes they are acting on behalf of some ancient entity, and the owl is its sigil? I grabbed a clean pair of gloves and a small evidence bag. I carefully retrieved the owl pendant from the first victim's belongings, the one I'd found tucked away in the evidence locker. I placed it inside the bag. Then I turned my attention back to the current victim. The reshaping of the clavicle, I said, my voice low and intense. It's not just a generic alteration. It's too specific, too deliberate, I think. I think it's meant to represent the wings of an owl spread in flight. The detective's brow furrowed, wings on a collarbone. Think about it, I urged, my mind racing. The stylized owl, the predator, the flight, it's a narrative. The killer is telling a story with each victim. I looked at the pendant again, the tiny etched owl seeming to mock me with its silent enigma. And this pendant, it's not just a clue, it's a signature, a calling card. I felt a surge of adrenaline, a clarity I hadn't experienced in years. The pieces were starting to fit, not neatly, but with a jagged, unsettling logic. This wasn't random. This was ritualistic. I need to go back to the archives, I said, my voice firm. I need to find out what kind of rituals involve owls and the clavicle and the idea of collecting spirits. And I need to find out what this owl symbol truly represents. The detective watched me, his expression unreadable in the dim light. And if I read wrong, UserZU, I met his gaze, a grim determination settling over me. Then we're all in more trouble than we know. The weight of the owl pendant in my pocket felt heavier than ever. It was a key, I was sure of it. A key to a door I was terrified to open, but one I had to walk through. The air in the medical examiner's office during a power outage was thick with the smell of disinfectant and something else. Something metallic and stale. My flashlight beam, a thin, wavering finger, danced across rows of stainless steel drawers. Each one a silent testament to a life cut short. The silence here, usually punctuated by the hum of machinery or hushed conversations, was now absolute, a heavy blanket pressing down. I'd come here on a hunch, a nagging feeling that the latest victim, the one found near the old observatory, held a piece of the puzzle I was missing. The preliminary report was sparse, the scene too disturbed by the elements. But the examiner, a gruff man who usually kept to himself, had mentioned something odd about the way the body had been positioned. Not just placed, he'd said, but arranged. My flashlight landed on a covered form on one of the examination tables. This was it. The wind outside howled, rattling the reinforced windows. I took a deep breath, the recycled air doing little to calm the flutter in my chest. This was what I did. I looked at the dead. I listened to their stories even when they couldn't speak. I pulled back the sheet, the pale skin, the stillness. It was a sight I'd grown accustomed to, yet it never failed to stir a deep unease. My light played over the features, the vacant eyes. Then I saw it. Tucked into the victim's hand, clutched tight, was a small, intricately carved wooden bird. Not an owl this time, a sparrow. My mind immediately flashed back to the university archives, to the dusty tomes I'd pored over, the obscure references to folk traditions. Sparrows were symbols of what? I couldn't quite place it. It felt important, though, too important to be accidental. A floorboard creaked behind me. I spun around, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the faint emergency lights from the hallway, was a figure. Tall, broad-shouldered. He stepped further into the room, his movements deliberate, unhurried. He was the head of the classics department, a man known for his eccentric lectures and his almost obsessive devotion to ancient Greek mythology. He'd been one of my mentors in a way, though our relationship had always been complicated. "UserZU," he replied, his voice a low rumble. "I didn't expect to find you here, especially not in these circumstances." I lowered my flashlight slightly but kept it trained on him. "I could say the same, Professor. What brings you to the medical examiner's office during a power outage?" He offered a small, almost imperceptible smile. Curiosity, a rather morbid fascination perhaps. I heard about the latest victim, another student taken by this phantom. He gestured vaguely towards the body on the table. "A tragedy, a profound tragedy. And you came to observe." My tone was sharp, laced with suspicion. He was too calm, too composed. "One tries to understand the patterns, UserZU, to find meaning in the chaos. You of all people should appreciate that." He took another step closer, his gaze sweeping over the room, lingering on the covered form. "The owl pendant, the cryptic symbols, it all points to something ancient, doesn't it? A ritual, a revival of forgotten rites." He was guessing, or was he? He knew about the owl pendant. I hadn't told anyone about that, not the police, not even my old colleagues. He paused, his head tilted. "I know it is a symbol of wisdom, of Athena, a powerful omen, but this sparrow," he gestured towards the victim's hand. "This is something else entirely, a messenger, a harbinger of change." My gut twisted. He was playing with me. His words were a carefully woven tapestry of truth and deception. He spoke of ancient rites, of symbols. His eyes held a flicker of something else, something I couldn't quite decipher. "You seem very knowledgeable about these rites, Professor," I added, trying to keep my voice even. "More than just a scholar of classics, perhaps." He chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "My dear UserZU, the university is built on layers of history, some of it buried very deep, and some of it." He looked down at the wooden sparrow. "This victim, they were involved in something, weren't they? Something they shouldn't have been." I tightened my grip on the flashlight. "What do I mean?" "A secret society, perhaps, a group dabbling in things they don't understand. The university has always attracted eager minds, minds that seek forbidden knowledge." He looked at me then, gaze piercing. "Just as I once did, UserZU." The accusation hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. He knew about my past, about the mistakes that had led to my disgrace. He was using it against me. "I am not my past, Professor," I answered, my voice firm, though my hands were trembling slightly. "Aren't we all, though?" He turned away from the body, facing me fully. The emergency lights cast his face in a stark, almost skeletal relief. "This killer, they are driven by a passion, an obsession, to preserve something, to reclaim something lost." He took a step towards the door. "Be careful, UserZU. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again." I stood there, the beam of my flashlight shaking, the smell of disinfectant suddenly overwhelming. Professor Thorne, he knew about my past, and he spoke of the killer's motives as if he understood them intimately. Was he the killer, or was he warning me? The sparrow, the messenger, what message was it trying to convey? My mind raced, trying to untangle the threads he'd spun. He had given me information, yes, but he had also planted seeds of doubt, of fear. The silence after Professor Thorne's departure was a heavy blanket, muffling the frantic thrumming in my chest. The disinfectant smell, usually a sterile comfort, now felt cloying, a thin veil over something far more unpleasant. He knew. He knew about the incident, the one that had driven me from academia, the one that had stained my name and my career. And he'd spoken about the killer's motives with an unnerving familiarity. My flashlight beam swept across the rows of stainless steel tables, each one a silent testament to lives cut short. The power outage had plunged the entire medical examiner's office during a power outage into a Stygian gloom, broken only by my wavering light. I needed to focus. Thorne's cryptic words, the way he'd looked at me, it was a distraction I couldn't afford. The remains. That's where the truth lay, not in the shadowed corridors of my past or the suspect pronouncements of a disgraced professor. I'd been working on the latest victim, a young woman whose life had been extinguished with brutal precision. The preliminary findings were already disturbing. The peculiar arrangement of the bones, the deliberate markings on the sternum, the almost artistic placement of certain artifacts. My gloved fingers traced the faint etchings on a fragment of bone I'd carefully bagged. They weren't random. They were symbols, ancient ones. I recognized them from my more obscure research. Not just any ancient practices, but those tied to specific cults, to groups obsessed with purification and rebirth. The killer wasn't just murdering, they were performing a twisted sacrament. A low hum vibrated through the floor. The emergency generator. Slowly, hesitantly, the overhead lights flickered on, bathing the room in a harsh, sterile glow. The sudden illumination made my eyes ache, but it also brought the details into sharp relief. I returned to the victim's skeletal remains, laid out on the table like a macabre puzzle. The victim's skull had been positioned facing east, a detail I'd noted but hadn't fully processed, and the small, carved wooden bird placed in the left hand. It was a common motif in ancient funerary rites, symbolizing the soul's journey. But this bird was different. Its eyes were inlaid with tiny flecks of obsidian, and its wings were angled in a specific, almost aggressive posture. My mind raced, sifting through a vast library of forgotten lore. I remembered a passage from a particularly dusty tome, one detailing a pre-Christian sect that believed the soul needed to be released from its earthly vessel, not just guided. They believed that the physical form held residual negative energy, and that this energy had to be purged before the soul could ascend. The obsidian eyes. They were meant to ward off malevolent spirits during this purification. This wasn't just about killing. This was about cleansing. The victims weren't just bodies, they were vessels, and the killer, in their warped mind, was performing a sacred duty. But why these students? What made them targets? I picked up another bagged item, a small, intricately folded piece of parchment found clutched in the victim's right hand. Unfolding it carefully, I saw a single, elegant symbol drawn in what looked like dried berry ink. It was a labyrinth, but not a typical one. This labyrinth had a single central point, and the lines were drawn with a heavy, almost desperate hand. A labyrinth, a journey, a purification. The killer believed they were guiding these souls, but the path they were forcing them onto was one of agonizing ritual. If the killer saw themselves as a liberator, a purifier, then their actions would only escalate. They wouldn't stop until they had completed their work. The university. It was always the university. The ancient stones, the hushed libraries, the generations of scholars. There was something buried deep within its history, a secret that had festered and now demanded to be brought to light through bloodshed. Thorne's knowledge, his unsettling calmness. He was more than just a concerned colleague. I looked back at the remains, the obsidian-eyed bird, the labyrinth symbol. The killer's motive wasn't simple hatred or revenge. It was a profound, terrifying conviction. They believed they were doing something righteous. And that, I realized with a sickening lurch, was the most dangerous motive of all. The generator hummed, a low, steady drone in the silent medical examiner's office during a power outage, a stark contrast to the turmoil raging within me. He knew. He knew about the incident, the one that had driven me from the pristine halls of academia and into the dusty silence of my own research. And now, here I was, back in the heart of it all, staring down the barrel of another nightmare. The emergency lights, usually a faint red glow, failed to ignite. A collective gasp rippled through the room, a chorus of startled breaths. My own breath hitched. This was not ideal, not at all. The killer, they had a pattern, a ritual. And I, UserZU, was the only one who could see the threads connecting the scattered pieces. The latest victim, the student found in the old observatory, bore the hallmarks of the others. The precise, almost surgical incisions, the placement of specific artifacts and ancient coin, a dried sprig of rosemary, a tarnished silver locket. Professor Thorne's veiled threat, his knowing gaze gnawed at me. He was involved, I was sure of it, but how and why? The incident. It felt like a lifetime ago, a ghost I tried to bury beneath layers of academic papers and late-night analysis. Now it was clawing its way back to the surface. I could feel the tremor in my hands, not of fear, but of building anticipation. The killer was methodical, almost arrogant. They left clues, not for the police, but for me. They wanted me to understand. They wanted me to see. UserZU, the chief medical examiner's voice, usually steady, held a note of unease. "Are you all right?" "Fine," I managed, my voice a low rasp. I needed to think. I needed a plan. The killer would strike again, I felt it in my bones. And this time I wouldn't be the one dissecting the aftermath. This time I would be the bait. I pictured the university grounds, the sprawling Gothic architecture, the hidden alcoves, the forgotten tunnels that snaked beneath the surface. The killer had an intimate knowledge of this place, a familiarity that spoke of deep roots, of a connection that went beyond mere student enrollment. They were a part of the university, like a parasitic growth. "We need to get some light in here," the senior technician grumbled, fumbling for his phone. The scene, once again illuminated, felt even more grim. The smell of formaldehyde seemed to thicken. I looked at the body, then at the scattered tools. The killer was intelligent, educated, someone who understood anatomy, perhaps even the art of preservation. My mind flashed back to the symbols etched into the victim's skin. They were ancient, specific. I'd spent weeks poring over obscure texts, cross-referencing forgotten languages, tracing the lineage of arcane rituals. The locket. It was identical to one I'd seen in the university's archives, belonging to a prominent benefactor from the late 19th century, a man obsessed with esoteric knowledge. The next ritual. It would be tied to a specific celestial event, a convergence of old and new. The killer wasn't just leaving clues, they were orchestrating a performance, and I was meant to be the sole audience member. "I have an idea," I responded, the words firm, surprising even myself. The others turned to me, their faces etched with exhaustion and apprehension. "What kind of idea?" the chief medical examiner asked, his brow furrowed. "A trap," I stated. "We know their pattern, we know what they're looking for, we can use it." I explained my theory, weaving together the disparate clues, the symbols, the artifacts, and the timing. The killer was drawn to places of historical significance, places that held a certain resonance. The old bell tower, the abandoned botanical gardens, the sealed wing of the library. They weren't just random locations, they were stages for their twisted drama. "We need to make them think we're falling for it," I continued, my voice gaining momentum. "We need to offer them a sacrifice, a prop that aligns with their obsession, something that will draw them out into the open." The senior technician snorted. "And what exactly are we offering, Professor?" A student volunteer. "No," I added, my gaze locking with his. "Something more. Symbolic. Something that speaks to their perceived legacy. The university has plenty of forgotten relics. We just need to expose one." A ripple of unease went through the room. This was dangerous. This was playing with fire, but the alternative was unthinkable. More bodies, more unanswered questions. "I'll need access to the archives," I stated, my mind already racing ahead, picturing the dusty shelves, the hidden compartments, the secrets they held. "And I'll need your cooperation. We'll set the bait and we'll wait." The chief medical examiner looked at me, his eyes searching mine. He saw the determination there, the flicker of the old fire that had made me a respected anthropologist before everything. "It's a long shot. UserZU," he replied, his voice grave. "But it's a shot," I countered, "and it's the only one we have." The generator sputtered to life, bathing the room in harsh fluorescent light. The body on the slab seemed to stare up at me, a silent plea. I wouldn't fail him. I wouldn't fail any of them. The trap was being set, and I was ready to spring it. The hum of the generator was a welcome, if shaky, sound in the otherwise suffocating silence of the medical examiner's office during a power outage. It cast long, dancing shadows that made the stark white walls seem to pulse. I leaned closer to the slab, my breath misting the cool air. The victim, the young man from the library, was laid out before me. His eyes, wide and vacant, held a story I was determined to finish. A sudden scraping sound from the hallway jolted me. It wasn't the usual creak of the old building settling. This was deliberate. I held my breath, listening. Footsteps, soft but steady, echoed closer. My hand instinctively went to the heavy scalpel on the tray beside me. It was a pathetic weapon, but it was all I had. The door to the autopsy suite creaked open, not violently, but with a slow, unnerving grace. Standing in the doorway was the archivist. He was silhouetted against the dim light from the corridor, his usual placid expression replaced by something sharp, intense. He held a single tarnished silver locket in his hand, the same one I'd found tucked inside the victim's pocket. "You shouldn't be here, UserZU," the archivist said, his voice a low murmur that seemed to vibrate with an unseen energy. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the generator's drone. "I could say the same about you. This is a crime scene." He took a step into the room and the light caught the locket, a faint gleam. "It's more than that. It's a culmination, a necessary correction." "Correction for what?" I demanded, my voice tight. "For what they did to him, to the others." The archivist let out a soft, almost sorrowful chuckle. "They don't understand, do they? The weight of history, the sacrifices made. They discard it, forget it. They see it as mere dust. But I remember, I honor." He moved further into the room, his eyes never leaving mine. He gestured to the body on the slab. He was meant to be a vessel, a final offering, to appease the old ways, to remind them of what they owe. My mind raced. The symbols, the timing, the specific nature of the wounds, it all clicked into place with a sickening finality. This wasn't random madness. This was a twisted form of devotion. "You think you're honoring them by butchering innocent students." "Innocent?" The archivist scoffed. "They are the descendants of those who profited. They live in the comfort built on forgotten promises. They are the careless inheritors of a legacy they refuse to acknowledge. This university, its very foundations are steeped in their blood, UserZU, and they have forgotten." He took another step, and I could see the glint of something else in his hand now, something long and thin, almost like a delicate needle. My gaze flickered to his right hand. It was bare, but his left was gloved, for someone who understood. "And I did," he admitted, a flicker of something that might have been pride in his eyes. "I saw the patterns. I understood the intent. I just chose the wrong side, the side of the forgetful." He extended the locket. "This belonged to the first one, the one who started it all, a token of their gratitude, a promise of continued favor." I stared at the locket, then back at him. It wasn't just bureaucratic inertia, it was complicity. They knew, or at least suspected, and they buried it, just like they buried me. "They chose comfort over truth," the archivist said, his voice hardening. "And now the debt must be paid. You can join me, UserZU. We can restore the balance, or you can become another forgotten detail." He lunged, not with brute force but with a surprising speed. The needle glinted. I reacted on pure instinct, shoving the heavy metal tray with all my might. It clattered across the floor, sending instruments skittering. He stumbled, his lunge interrupted. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the nearest heavy object, a thick, leather-bound ledger from a nearby desk, and swung. It connected with his shoulder, a dull thud. He grunted, momentarily stunned. I didn't wait to see the effect. I bolted for the door, my boots slipping on the slick linoleum. Behind me, I heard him recover, his footsteps quickening. He was no longer the placid archivist. He was a hunter, and I was the prey. I burst into the corridor, the dim light offering little comfort. I knew this building, I knew its secrets, and now I knew its deepest shame. I had to get out. I had to get help. But more importantly, I had to make sure his twisted legacy ended here. The trap was sprung, but the hunt had just begun. The air in the medical examiner's office during a power outage was thick, heavy with the smell of disinfectant and something else. Something metallic and coppery that clung to the back of my throat. The emergency lights cast long, dancing shadows, making familiar equipment look like monstrous silhouettes. He lunged. The needle glinted. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the nearest heavy object, a polished granite paperweight shaped like a femur, and swung. Silence. Then a soft thud, my breath hitched. The emergency lights flickered, then steadied. He was on the floor, unmoving. The needle lay a few feet away, still gleaming malevolently. I stood there, chest heaving, the paperweight still clutched in my hand. My mind raced, a chaotic jumble of adrenaline and disbelief. It was over. Over. The subsequent hours were a blur of flashing blue lights outside, hushed voices, and the methodical process of the real authorities taking over. I recounted the events, my voice raspy, my hands still trembling. They asked about the needle, about his motives, about the symbols he'd etched into the victims. I answered as best I could, the pieces clicking into place with a grim finality. It wasn't a cult, not in the way the initial theories had suggested. It was something far more personal, a twisted obsession born from a deep-seated resentment and a warped sense of academic legacy. The university, once a bastion of quiet tradition, was now a hive of hushed speculation and uncomfortable truths. The old guard, the ones who had dismissed me so readily, were now scrambling to control the narrative. They called it a tragic incident, a deranged individual, anything to distance themselves from the reality of what had transpired within their hallowed and now deeply stained walls. I found myself back in my temporary office, the same one I'd occupied when this nightmare began. The air was still, the fluorescent lights humming with a steady, reassuring rhythm. The clutter of case files, photographs, and my own frantic scribbles remained, a testament to the journey. I picked up a small, intricately carved wooden figurine, a replica of a pre-Columbian fertility idol I'd studied years ago. It was one of the killer's calling cards, a symbol he'd believed connected him to a lineage of forgotten knowledge. Now, it felt like a relic of a past I was finally ready to leave behind. A colleague, one of the few who had shown me genuine support, poked her head in. "UserZU, are I all right?" I managed a weak smile. "As all right as I can be, I suppose. They're already talking about the memorial service," she said softly, her eyes filled with a mixture of sympathy and awe. "And the university? They're forming a committee to review everything." I nodded. The wheels of institutional damage control were already in motion. They try to bury the ugliness to polish the tarnished image of their esteemed institution. But the truth, once unearthed, has a way of sticking. It festers. It demands to be acknowledged. I looked at the figurine again. The obsession, the drive to uncover hidden truths, it was a powerful force. I understood it. I'd lived it. But I'd also seen its destructive potential, how it could warp and consume. The methods I'd employed, the risks I'd taken, they had been necessary, but they had also pushed me to the brink. My own past mistakes, the academic downfall that had landed me here, it all felt different now. Not erased, not forgotten, but understood in a new light. I had been too eager, too blinded by my own ambition. This case had forced me to confront that part of myself, to recognize the fine line between dedication and obsession. The colleague hesitated. "So what now, UserZU, are I?" Going back to my old position. I considered it. The thought of returning to the sterile labs, the endless paperwork, the petty academic politics. It held no appeal. Not anymore. My hands, which had once meticulously catalogued bones and reconstructed ancient lives, had also held a weapon. My mind, which had navigated complex anthropological puzzles, had also grappled with a killer's twisted logic. I stood up, walking towards the window. The university grounds below looked peaceful, deceptively so. "No," I said, my voice firming with a newfound clarity. "I don't think I will. I would continue my work, but on my own terms. There were other bodies to examine, other stories buried in the earth, other truths waiting to be uncovered. The world was a vast, messy, and often brutal place, and the dead, as always, needed someone to speak for them. And I, UserZU, was finally ready to listen.